The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world. Greetings, Poe fans. The Poetastic 2 are back.
And ready for more. I am Jeanie.
And I am Carmen.
And we're here to tell you about the wonderful detective that was never, ever talked about until, well, I don't know. When did he start getting talked about?
Let's see.
I know we always talk about Edgar Allan Poe, but guess what? He's the reason we talk about him.
Well, just kind of looking up things about detectives really when you think about detectives, you think about mystery fiction and things like that. Mm-hmm. It goes back to Shakespearean times, but when you think about the origination of the detective, Poe wrote his first story that was around the detective, C. Auguste Dupin, and I'm not sure if I am doing that correctly in French.
Sounds good to me.
But that was 1841 with the murders in the Rue Morgue.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. We start with the Shakespearean times because, Shakespeare, he was the main guy.
Exactly.
Main guy in literature, in wording. He gave us more of the weird slang terms that we use now that not a lot of people know.
Oh, I know. It's fun to actually have that in class and let kids basically word fight with those.
Yeah, because half the time they have no idea what they're saying anyway, but it sounds cool.
Yes, it does.
And we want to, strike a pose.
Exactly. And so, when this is our first degree we're talking about, which is literature, and we chose to do the detective because it is such an impact, and Jeanie and I both love detective fiction, mysteries, and all of those things. And one thing that Poe did with creating our fun detective, Dupin, he also, his very first story with Murders in the Rue Morgue had the locked room mystery, which other authors have used, here and there,
numerous
TV
times.
shows, things like that. And the cool thing is when you think about Poe and creating this, how many other detectives have come from just this one man?
Yeah, and you always have to have the one that starts it all. And most of us know that Edgar Allan Poe, when we think about it, everybody automatically says nevermore.
Yes.
Because that is the first thing that comes to mind with Edgar Allan Poe is his poetry. The Raven and Annabelle Lee and all that, because that's mainly what we teach in school is the poetry aspect. Not a lot of people realize that he was an actual fictional author, and one of those was the detective story.
Yes.
And I just am fascinated because he brought in the medical jargon. He brought in the true deductive reasoning.
Yes, and really almost like forensics, even though forensics wasn't necessarily a thing back then.
Yeah,
and what we now know it as today.
Yeah, forensics wasn't talked about as an actual forensics science.
No.
But the science at the time, because we had Charles Darwin at that point going around and talking about the history of the evolution, and Galapagos Islands was discovered, and he found all this wonderful stuff. And then, of course, Edgar Allan Poe hopped on that bandwagon, and he said, dude, let's take the Enlightenment period that we're going to talk about, not only the revelations of the church trying to get back into people's homes, but now science, along with Sir Isaac Newton, find about gravity. The sky is falling. The sky is falling.
Yes.
And now we got Charles Darwin going, hey, yeah, those people and those animals, and they might come in handy and be something like each other.
Exactly.
So Edgar was just one of those
pioneer.
Yes, pioneer and visionaries, and using it in fiction to get people's know-how to say, hey, I can figure that out myself.
Exactly. And the fun of figuring out a murder mystery especially is just so awesome. And, kind of looking at his character of Dupin, he is a very kind of eccentric kind of fellow. He doesn't really have a catchphrase, which some modern detectives do have that, and that's okay. He was the first, so he did what he wanted to do.
Oh, yeah.
He definitely uses the analysis with the deductive reasoning, and he also Poe called that ratiocination, which I thought was a very cool word.
Yeah, most people would be like, what does that mean? I don't know what that is. What did you just say? What language are you speaking?
Exactly. But it literally is just that deductive.
Rational thinking.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
all it is just thinking
Analysis.
rationally.
Another kind of attribute about Dupin is there is a narrator.
Mm-hmm.
He is his roommate. We know that, but he is nameless. He doesn't have a name, which I thought was kind of interesting. That
he was the first sidekick, because we always know the sidekick never gets any kind of recognition.
No.
So very much so Edgar Allan Poe may have started that also, because the first narrator was the sidekick with no name.
Exactly. But very
Poor guy.
Integral for the story.
Yeah.
The police department that he works with are definitely the bumbling police, as we all look at in all these kind of stories.
Yeah, especially in the old stories, they have like the bonnets, the coppers, the ones that just walk a beat and they're not really into. I mean, cause think of Sherlock Holmes, Lestat. I'm sorry,
Lestat.
Thank you. Lesage, one of those.
Yes.
And he was not very well liked.
No.
Was not very taken to by anyone, and thought to be basically an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
So Poe started with that same idiosyncrasy of, yeah, they're not really very good at their job.
Exactly. And then one other thing Dupin loves to do, he smokes a meerschaum pipe. Mm-hmm. He loves reading by candlelight, and he really likes hieroglyphics. And knowing Poe was kind of on the side a cryptologist, and he puts a lot of those puzzles and cryptology and things like that in his stories. And so adding this in for Dupin really just kind of mirrors Poe's interests in his own life, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and it goes back to always is that write what you know. And Dupin, in some instances, is Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes.
He's putting most of his personality into it because he's deductive reasoning in his stories and his poems. He's talking about tragedy. He's talking about forensics in some areas. And he knows what he needs to say and how he needs to say it. And so he creates characters that fit that profile.
Exactly. And so, thinking about all of those little things that we've just kind of named about our detective from Poe, who does that sound like, Jeanie?
Oh, I do believe he is the smart, the funny, the idiosyncrasies of them all, Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, and what a coincidence that Sherlock Holmes, written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is amazing, and if you have not read any of his works, they're very, very well done. Not just the movies that we watch and TV shows and things like that.
Of course not.
His first, The Study in Scarlet, is a great place to start.
Yes, and if I'm not mistaken, I do believe that, like Edgar Allan Poe, the tales of Sherlock Holmes also started in a newspaper. Or
they
a
started
magazine,
in magazines,
a magazine.
yes,
So
absolutely.
Because that's Edgar Allan Poe. He started the short story of Dupin, and it was just a short series in a newspaper.
Exactly.
And then Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, most people didn't realize this, but he was an actual doctor in real life.
Yes, he was.
And gave up being a physician to, wait for it, become an author.
Yes.
So all of his bringing in of the forensics of the scientific side into his stories, he truly had a first-hand knowledge of how it works on the body, the anatomy of that time, anyway. So that also goes back to the same thing with Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Darwin and reading the natural selection. And then now we have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is actual registered and passed fully, medical doctor,
exactly,
writing about what he knows.
Yes, and just kind of looking up dates and things like that. Arthur Conan Doyle did this or published the study in Scarlet in a magazine in 1887, and then The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes came out in 1892 in October.
Yeah, so not very long afterwards. Because in that time frame, that was the main medium for the people, those
right.
that had the education and could read,
yes,
and could afford the magazines and the newspapers, because they could not afford the books, because books weren't that popular back then.
Exactly, and more readily available too.
Exactly,
they didn't have the bookstores. Yeah, yes. And then, looking at just kind of doing a little research more into Doyle, he actually said, where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it?
Exactly. And that's the thing. It only takes one person to
yes.
spark that idea or light that match for everybody to jump on it and say, woohoo, let's join the bonfire.
Exactly.
It's time to burn this down.
And how many of those have there been? So many.
Lost track sometimes.
Yeah. And then so the Poe basically with Dupin wrote three short stories, I should say, with his character. So he first the Murders in the Rue Morgue. Then he did The Mystery of Marie Roget,
right,
and which was based on a true story. And then the last one he did was The Purloined Letter.
Right.
And it's the shortest of the three, but very powerful. It's a really cool story.
Yeah, and the wording, The Purloined Letter, always makes me think of food. The sirloin, not sirloin, it's purloin.
Yes, kind of like our recipe from the Halloween special.
Exactly. Hey, you can tie food into literature all day long for me.
Absolutely. But one of the things that we did a couple months ago, kind of delving deeper into looking at some of the media that has been done on his Murders in the Rue Morgue, was we had a Poe watching day with some of our friends, and we watched the three versions of the Murders in the Rue Morgue in order of dates. And so we started with the first one in 1932 with Bela Lugosi.
Yeah, almost 100 years later.
Yes.
Because this is the time frame when we actually started getting the moving picture with sound.
Yeah, exactly. So, Jeannie, do you want to tell us a little bit about that version?
It was rather interesting because you're introduced to, first of all, let me just say, Bela Lugosi is a man that had no equal in any way, shape, or form. Now, I still am, freaked out about his unibrow in certain areas.
Yes.
But no, he was wonderful in that time frame with his dry, his critical, just his talk, his mannerisms. But the show really brought it down, and it was very interesting that he was playing this carnival character.
Yes.
Who was trying to say that he had an ape that could talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked into that. Yes, it was more or less long. They were bringing in some of that time frame, that history of what was going on in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, he was so apt to wanting to figure out all these women. And you think, oh, wait, he's a stalker.
Yes.
Great. Now we're walking. He is a stalker. So you're waiting for it going, oh, no, this is not going to turn into one of those modern day Criminal Minds episodes.
Right.
But the whole issue is that Bela Lugosi, his character, was looking to find the perfect match that he could cross, impregnate.
Yes.
A female to have a child that is half ape and half human.
Yes.
So on that aspect, he was nuts.
Yeah, and we're going to try not to do too many spoilers if you have not read the story, but that part of that movie is definitely not in Poe's story.
No, it's not. That's why there's
the Hollywood license,
fictional licensure there.
Yes,
but it was so well bringing out the tie-in with the Charles Darwin age.
Absolutely.
With the evolutionary ideas and all that. So I think that's more or less why they were pushing it.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, because at the same time frame in the world, or in the United States, we were having the certain trials
Yes.
Scopes monkey trial.
Mm-hmm.
So they were using that to build their popularity.
Yes, absolutely.
So they took someone, Edgar Allan Poe, took his writing, took his story. They made it into one of the first black and white movies, and they recreated something, and it really brought out how deductive reasoning, the sidekick, the science,
the
all
locked
that.
room.
Exactly, the locked room, the ideas of the human mind in general
Yes.
were being brought into vision so everybody could see it. Those that didn't read Edgar Allan Poe or those that weren't readers, and I hate to say it, during the 1930s, there was still a lot of illiteracy.
Yes.
In the United States at the time. So this was the first time you could allude to something visually that maybe some people would never have a chance to know.
I agree. And there were lots of elements in the movie, too, that were true to Poe's story, which we really liked. But the part of the science of that with the crossbreeding, however you want to frame it, was definitely out of character of the story. But we kind of categorized it as the second best of the three.
Exactly. It was not top of the Dupin and the detective issues of that.
Right.
Because that was kind of low key, in my opinion, of that
Was.
version.
Yeah.
Even though you are seeing Dupin, you are getting the sidekick, you are getting the intro into the science and the criminology about it. You're not really getting the Edgar Allan Poe story.
Right, exactly. You're getting elements of it.
I would only get it like a 2.5, maybe 3 star.
Yes. And then, so we took a little break, and then we put on the 1979 version of Murders in the Rue Morgue,
good Lord,
starring Jason Robards. And I don't think we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this. Jason Robards is an excellent actor.
Absolutely.
But this version, the only thing that it had that really was in common, with Edgar Allan Poe's story is it had the name of his story.
Yeah, how the Murders of the Rue Morgue, because the premise, let's just put it that, was the story in the story.
Yes.
So it was a dedication of the story that was being acted out, but it was not the actual story of the movie.
Exactly.
It was one of those.
It was allegorical in a weird way.
Exactly. And it was very much 1979-ish.
Yes.
Because sometimes I'm thinking, okay, what do we have to be smoking to watch this show?
Yes, exactly. we all were like, okay, but we had to trudge through. We watched the whole thing.
Yes, we did.
We're better for it.
Like Carmen said, Jason Robards is an excellent actor, so we got to watch some, very well storytelling.
Right.
From that point of view.
Exactly.
So, and then later, barely 8 years maybe? Not even 8 years.
Yeah, not
more
even.
like 7 years later, there was another version that came out, but this one came out with the lead of George C. Scott.
Yes.
Oh, that man.
And Val Kilmer is the sidekick.
Yeah, and you would not even recognize it until you're sitting there and all of a sudden you're going, dude, I know that guy.
Exactly.
That's Val Kilmer. And this is around the time, Top Gun.
Exactly.
So this was kind of tying in together about that.
And
but
made for TV.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Made
that was
for TV.
That was what was really cool, too.
And this is the closest one out of all three that went with the Edgar Allan Poe story.
Yes, and I think the biggest factor that went away from the story was adding that Dupin had a daughter who was played by Rebecca De Mornay.
Yeah.
And it fit in with the story, but it wasn't necessary. But I can see why they would do that. And the acting was very good and very well done. Very
much the Hollywood licensure at work again. But like you said, it fit very well in the story.
They did a very good job with that.
And in my opinion also, they brought in an older actor of George C. Scott.
Yes.
To portray where in the other versions, even with Jason Robards, the character of Dupin was not that old. He was more of like mid-30s, late 30s. But with the George C. Scott one, he was more of a middle-aged elderly man who was having to retire from being a police officer. That was another difference.
Yes.
Than the original of Edgar Allan Poe. Dupine was actually a retired police.
Yes.
Whereas in the original story, the guy was just a medical
armchair
savant,
detective, basically.
Yeah, so there were some definitely creative license going on there, but it was the best of the best because I contribute that to the excellent not only writing of Edgar Allan Poe, but the adaptation of Hollywood and George C. Scott.
Absolutely.
So if you haven't seen any of those, definitely check them out and watch them in order.
Yes, and I don't remember which channels we streamed them from, but all 3 were free to access. So that was the kind of cool thing.
Yeah, you can get them on the data streaming.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just type it in. You should be able to find it. If you have a Roku or a smart TV, I'm sure you can just type it in and they'll find it.
Yeah, just do the search feature. So, kind of winding up with thinking about just Poe in general and Dupine, it's just kind of interesting to think about that, Poe only was able to write these 3 stories.
Right.
It would be interesting to see if he had lived longer, would he have continued to write more of these stories about this character?
Yeah, and created, as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did,
a
whole series dedicated to him.
Exactly.
And became an icon later on.
Absolutely. And like when you think about Sherlock Holmes, kind of, that comparison of the 2 detectives, they're very similar, which the homage that Doyle paid to Poe is phenomenal with that. And, when you think about how many versions that have been done and all the famous actors who have played, I loved when I was a kid watching the Basil Rathbone versions back.
Oh, yes.
They would come on like Saturday or Sunday afternoons, like at noon. Or late night.
And him in that funky hat and that funky pipe. And you're going, dude.
And the cape coat. I'm not sure what that's called, but
I'm not either. But
I'm going to have to make one.
Yeah. And one of the other things that's really ironic in my point of view is that Edgar Allan Poe wrote Dupine, and Dupine was a French man.
Yes.
Which goes along with how he loved to write. He loved to write with French as the background, some settings from people.
Faraway lands.
Exactly, faraway lands. And then, of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was British.
Exactly.
And so Sherlock Holmes ended up being a British,
yes,
detective. Loved his little 221B. No.
Yes. Yeah, 221B. Yep, that's it.
I was thinking of Harry Potter there for a minute, going, wait a minute. No, what is it? No, not 9 3/4. No.
You're mixing your numbers.
Yeah, I'm mixing my British people and my numbers there.
That's okay. That's totally okay. And so, again, they're both Dupin and Holmes are excellent detectives, and the stories written about them you definitely will enjoy. And so, but furthering how the impact of just these 3 stories,
effect,
trickle down. Exactly. Jeannie's exactly right. How many other detectives have been written that are timeless and that, will be read, these stories will be read from now until the end of time. And another one that we kind of chose is
Mr. Hercule Poirot from Agatha Christie.
Yes, our favorite Belgian detective.
Oh, yes.
Who also has his idiosyncrasies as well, the little gray cells.
Exactly. Got to get the little gray cells activated so they can
his
do
mustaches.
His job. Oh, I love the mustache.
Yes.
And he had a sidekick who was a doctor also.
Yes.
So that goes along with the whole Sherlock Holmes. And,
it does.
My adage is, if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Exactly.
So that's what Agatha Christie went with.
Exactly. And she even pays homage to Edgar Allan Poe in the story The Third Girl. Or it's actually called Third Girl. And I'm going to read just a line from that. She says, he had finished his magnum opus, an analysis of great writers of detective fiction. He had dared to speak scathingly of Edgar Allan Poe. She pays homage in doing the research. I never really could find that he was definitely a
influencer.
Yes, influence. However, she does say Sherlock Holmes, which it's just, again, that trickle-down effect.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have one without the other.
That's right.
You know, Dupin was the stone that started the rolling.
Yes.
And then Arthur Conan Doyle picked it up and ran with it down with Sherlock Holmes, and now Agatha Christie found that, hey, wait a minute, we can roll even farther with this, so I'm going to bring in Hercule Poirot, which was only one of her detectives that she created.
Oh, yes. And we have Miss Jane Marple.
Oh, yes.
Love her, too.
The female homebody who had a mind like Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
And a wit like Hercule Poirot. But also had the Dupin effect because she was so very underrated.
Yes.
And that's what I think of when I think of Dupin, is how he was such a normal guy.
Yeah.
That was always being underrated, underseen. And then, you know, she was always seen that way also. Miss Marple was just, hey, she was the little busybody next door.
Exactly. And especially in the movie adaptations of her, especially in the Margaret Rutherford, who is my favorite actress that played her. It's like the police get annoyed that she's shown up, you know. It's like, oh, not you again.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, you're just another little busybody. Mind your own.
Exactly. And I can say from the other two stories of Poe, Marie Roget and the Purloined Letter, he's more respected down the road.
Yes.
So
it always takes a while for that to be known.
Yes.
And I mean, because most of these, especially when you're talking about the detective series, the police are always wanting to keep the commoners out of it because they don't want them, or they don't believe that they know what they're talking about or knowing what they're doing.
Exactly.
I mean, even Sherlock Holmes, he always had a love-hate relationship. You know, I totally blanked. What is the name of the
Inspector Japp?
No, the name of the actual yard, Scotland Yard.
Oh yes, yes.
Good Lord.
I'm mixing my detectives up.
Yeah, I was blanking out there for a minute. I was
Japp
like,
is from Perot.
Yeah, Perot is Japp, and I'm like, no, but Scotland Yard, and they would begrudgingly seek out Sherlock Holmes, but it was just so demeaning in their point of view to actually have to go to some commoner to ask for help.
But it was almost like, because Holmes was so intelligent, I think that it was an intimidation thing, but also we want to do this ourselves. This is our job. You're not supposed to be doing this kind of thing.
And they don't like because definitely Sherlock Holmes is always showing him up.
Oh, yeah.
He never did anything halfway.
No.
It's like, let me show you how stupid you are while I'm doing your job.
Exactly.
And so then Hercule, in some aspects, because that's one thing I like about Agatha Christie, she also made Hercule have a past as being a police officer. You know, he wasn't just a commoner. He had ran away during the, World War One.
Right, exactly.
To escape Nazis and ended up in England. And that's how he became more popular, because he was a Belgian detective.
Yes, exactly.
And so that was very interesting. And the way he got into the country, I found this out, through the reading and then the creative license that they took with the shows and stuff, is that he dressed up as a priest. And he escaped from the Nazis that way.
That's interesting.
Yes, so it was very interesting. I won't give anything else away, but it's just very much something that you can look it up and watch the British TV shows.
Yes. Oh, yes. And Hercule Poirot, try to pronounce that correctly, 1920 was where he first came into the world in the story The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And then in 1926, Agatha Christie really achieved like kind of more major recognition with her story, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And I remember reading that one, and I like both of those, but the Roger Ackroyd story is really good.
Yeah, I think it's truly ironic that there's almost exactly a 40-year difference between each one of these.
Yes.
You know, you got Edgar Allan Poe in the 1840s,
right,
with Dupin, and then 40 years later in the late 1880s, you have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and then about another 40 years down the road, oh look, there's Agatha Christie.
Exactly.
So it's like, oh, it's a trend.
And in doing some research more into her, she began writing when she was a nurse in World War I, and Poirot actually came out of, her seeing a lot of Belgians that she was nursing and things like that. I thought that was really interesting. And then Miss Marple was kind of based off of her step-grandmother. Yes. And so I thought that was really interesting, too.
Once more, writing what you know.
Yeah, she wrote about her experiences.
Yeah, and Agatha Christie, I've always been such a fan of hers, along with Mary Shelley.
Yes.
Because they were women that were in a time where it was, well, and now too, but not as the extent as it was back then, of a male-dominated world. And they were trying to get into the area where there are actually some women in history that wrote under a pen name of a man that no one knows about.
Exactly.
Because they wanted to be heard, but if they were writing their name on it and it was a female name, no, I don't think so.
Exactly.
Mary Shelley was the one that says, try me.
Yeah.
And then Agatha is like, here we go.
Yes.
Let me do it right here.
Yeah. And one of the things that Agatha Christie did with her detectives is she kind of took the same things that Poe and Holmes did, or Poe and I want to say them, Holmes is Doyle, Doyle is Holmes.
Yes.
Poe and Doyle did. She did all of those things that they did with the whodunit style, but she added in the putting the suspects all in one room. She was kind of the first one to pioneer that, which is really cool that she, stepped it up a little bit.
Yeah, she had to bring something new to the table.
Yes.
Like Holmes, he had his own little quirks about doing things. He would make sure that he would be there and be right in the face of it and make sure to tell the person that you're guilty, and I've figured out how.
Exactly.
But then Agatha is like, hey, I want everybody involved.
Yes.
So I can make you all sound suspicious, and then all of you squirm in your seat before I point the finger.
Exactly.
At the exact person.
Which when you think about the Agatha Christie story, And Then There Were None, it like for us, it's on our reading list for 8th grade English. It is a lower lexile, but it's so complex because you have all of the characters you have to keep up with.
Oh, yes.
And so, but she's, all three of these people are brilliant.
Yes, and Agatha, to my opinion, was one of the ones that showed not only the brilliance of deductive reasoning and the detective world, but she also brought in a lot of the humanity.
Yes.
Of what people have to go through. And one of those that is the epitome is the Murder on the Orient Express.
Oh, yes. It's one of my favorites.
I mean, it is just so well written to bring out that maybe not everything is black and white and cut and dry. Just because you may commit a crime doesn't mean that you are, in essence, evil.
Right. Exactly.
And that's one of the things that I loved about Agatha. Is she brought that onto not only paper but onto screen.
Yes.
And some of her other characters started feeding into some others along the way.
Yes. And I was saying that the movie version 1979 of Orient Express is so good with Albert Finney and all of the players. But then the Kenneth Branagh edition that he did back in, I believe,
it was 2017.
I think something like
maybe somewhere around that
somewhere
time.
around that time.
About 5 years.
It was excellent too, and I can't wait for Death on the Nile.
Oh, me either. I mean, Kenneth Branagh, he was just so captivating in Dunkirk.
Yes.
And the way that he just brings it onto screen, you're like, wow. And he did Poirot proud.
Yes, he did.
Very much so.
Absolutely.
And he brought his own brand of detective to that one.
Absolutely. And there have been several others who have played Poirot. Speaking of Tony Randall, Alfred Molino, Peter Ustinov, who's one of my favorites, Kenneth Branagh, Albert Finney, David Suchet, John Malkovich, Andrew Sachs, Ian Holm, and Austin Trevor. So we have a laundry list of actors who have played Poirot, and I can't think of any that I've seen on this list that were bad. They were all good.
No, and I mean, the one that I know the most about is the one that I love to watch is David Suchet.
Yes.
And
excellent.
The one thing I love the most about this cast of actors is they bring their own brand of the character onto stage, even though they're playing the exact same character from the book.
Yes.
No one of them has brought the exact same Poirot.
Yes.
They're all different, but you love every one of them.
I agree, and I think some of the elements are the people themselves, but also the time frame of when they're filmed. Exactly,
because they very much stick with the history, the aspect of the environment, of what's going on, the global, It's just wonderful the way they portray him.
Absolutely. And then we actually didn't really talk about as much of Sherlock Holmes, who's played him, but just off the top of my head, I can think of, Benedict Cumberbatch.
Absolutely. Robert Downey Jr.
Yes, those are all very different and fun. We did talk about Basil Rathbone. Yes. I'm trying to think. There's somebody else I'm forgetting.
Me too, but I cannot think. It's right there on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, exactly.
But with Benedict
the Johnny Lee Miller for the Elementary show, that was really good too.
That made for TV side of Sherlock Holmes was rather interesting.
Yes, and adding Lucy Liu as Watson was brilliant.
Yes,
that was really cool.
Very progressive.
Yes.
And very different, but yet kept the same aspect of the love that we have for Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly, yes.
And the detective and the whodunit. But Agatha, she definitely started a charge that way, and then leading into after the Depression and the World War, that kind of ripped us all to pieces.
Exactly, yeah.
And so, I mean, we still had the pandemic of the 1918s during the World War. So let's throw a pandemic and a World War and, all this in together and see what we can come up with.
Exactly. And then talking about, kind of going over to Miss Marple a little bit, we have lots of actresses who've played her. And I've already mentioned Margaret Rutherford, but we also have Inga Langen, Julia McKenzie, Yoonjin Kim, Ida Ever, Helen Hayes, Geraldine McEwen, Joan Hickson, and we have Angela Lansbury.
Oh yes,
who also was I'm on the end of season 10. Murder, She Wrote.
Miss Jessica Lange.
Yeah, Jessica Fletcher.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh yeah, wrong. Different.
It's okay.
Jessica Lange was the actor in Driving Miss Daisy.
Yes.
Jessica Fletcher was. Wow.
No, that was Jessica Tandy.
There's way too many Jessicas.
Yes.
The only Jessica I'm missing is the one in Roger Rabbit, apparently.
There you go.
Go with that one.
There you go. No, love it.
Okay.
But yes, and so...
Lansbury. Yes,
when
Lansbury.
You can still, again, think about all the different types of detective fiction that's come out from Poe. So, it's just, again, we're going back to this trickle-down effect. So you've got Murder, She Wrote, you've got Monk, Perry Mason, Father Dowling Mysteries, Diagnosis Murder, Death in Paradise, Columbo, Matlock, even Dick Tracy, and one, or actually a couple, they're like a trio, who Jeannie's going to talk quite a bit about, and that is the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew.
Absolutely. Because, of course, in that time frame after Agatha Christie, that's when school was starting to really take off again, and they were trying to put some interest into fiction for young adults.
Exactly.
And what better way to do that was to bring in murder.
Yes.
Murder is a great way to get children involved
in things.
Yes, intrigue, deductive reasoning. So Franklin W. Dixon, who, by the way, was not the writer of the Hardy Boys. His name was put on there as author, but all of them were written by ghostwriters.
That is so cool to think about that.
Yes, it is. And it was great because they introduced a younger version. These were teenagers who used their father, who was a detective in his own right, who turned into a private investigator. And they had grown up learning how to do fingerprints. They learned all these forensics.
That's neat.
How to investigate a murder, investigate any kind of things. And then they turned it into their own little world because things started happening. Because we know as much as anything that it's not just adults that crime or these types of things happen to. So when they involved the young adults and they involved Frank and Joe Hardy, they became like the detective and the sidekick. And one of the great things about these characters is they can switch out. You have Frank, who is very analytical, who is very much the forensic side of things. He's the profiler. He's that type of personality. But then you have Joe, who is the more personable one, like the narrator or the doctor to Sherlock Holmes or someone else.
Yes.
You know, like on Hercule Poirot, who is his sidekick, Captain.
Why is his name escaping me?
Okay.
You keep talking.
And so you have this with a young area, but then they have all this that they bring into play. And it's very formulaic, the way that they investigate. They start with the crime, then they start with the forensics, then they do the investigation, and then they're breaking it all down. And they're following the exact same steps that they've been taught by their father, who is an actual detective.
That's cool.
And so then they introduce a new character, and this character was introduced because of Franklin W. Dixon, even though he was not the writer. He was, in fact, a true person in life that they, used his name, had a daughter. And his daughter was like, okay, come on, Dad. We need a female.
Yes.
So that's when Carolyn W. Keene was born with Nancy Drew, because
Gotcha.
You can't just have male detectives.
Right.
Agatha Christie proved that when she introduced Miss Marple. So then now in young adult world, we have Miss Nancy Drew being introduced, who all has her own sidekicks.
Yes.
And so she does the exact same thing. The only difference is that her father isn't a detective. He's a reporter.
Okay. That makes sense too. It all ties together.
You've got to investigate. Or was it a lawyer? No. I wasn't. I'll admit. I'm gonna say this. Don't take away my young adult card here. But I was more a Frank and Joe Hardy fan than I was a Nancy Drew fan.
Gotcha.
I did love the crossovers.
Yes.
And then, of course, in the early 1970s, you had the show Frank and Joe Hardy. The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew.
77 to 79, and that was played by Parker Stevenson and Sean Cassidy.
Oh, yeah.
And then Pamela Sue Martin, who you might know from Dynasty fame, was Nancy Drew to their Hardy Boys.
Yes, and of course, if you recognize Sean Cassidy, you would have to recognize his brother,
David,
with the Partridge Family, which is another irony that show, too, would have some aspects of a mystery involved. If you think about it, it wasn't just all song and dance.
Right, exactly.
They had some kind of mystery involved to it.
Yes.
So all these tie-ins and all these little strings.
Well, and that makes me think of Scooby-Doo, and I love Scooby-Doo.
Where are you? We got some work for you now. I got to think of the mystery van now, and you got Shaggy as his sidekick, and Scooby. But Scooby he didn't work for free. I mean, come on, you got to give him the Scooby snacks.
Exactly. And kind of going back, Poirot's sidekick is Captain Hastings. I always forget his name. I don't know why.
And I don't know why I should, because every time I think of his name, the Captain Hastings, I think the Battle of Hastings.
Yes.
In 1098. I mean, come on. That's the history aspect.
You got to remember that.
You got to remember that. But yes, you got the young adults that you brought into play, because guess what? Not only was young adult fiction starting to take a boom, but you had the War of the Worlds with the wonderful radio people happening. So scaring the dickens out of everybody in that time frame, because they thought the aliens had landed.
Yes. And then one other thing that I just thought of, I'm actually looking up the year this came out, with thinking about the young adult fiction, because Hardy Boys was first published in 1927 and then Nancy Drew 1930. But when you were talking about the boys and, you know, having these stories created to really, you know, kind of hook in, you know, kids into reading as well as the mystery and all of that, it made me think of a Doris Day Gordon McRae movie, By the Light of the Silvery Moon, which is a sequel to On Moonlight Bay. And I know this is kind of going in a weird tangent, but
it works.
By the Light of the Silvery Moon, Doris Day's brother in the movie, his name is Wesley. I can't remember what the actor's name is off the top of my head, but this movie came out in 1953. But he became interested in being a detective. He's sent away for this detective kit, and you have this little aspect going on within the movie of the other big storylines. And his pet turkey, is his sidekick.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
so I had to throw that in because it really ties into the Hardy Boys kind of thing.
Oh, most definitely. And one of the things that I love the most about when the Hardy Boys and they started taking off their popularity and everything.
Yes.
They actually, if I'm not mistaken, it was Simon and Schuster who owned the publishing rights.
Okay.
And I think they still do.
Okay.
They actually published a fingerprinting and detective handbook.
That's awesome.
For young adults to teach them how to do all these forensics at the drop of a hat.
That's cool.
And
that's really cool.
The irony of the other day, we were talking, because I'm currently teaching about science, and I was teaching about how fingerprints and genetics and everything, because they've made leaps and bounds in all these years.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you go back to the very first fingerprints, it was way back in the Babylonian times.
That is amazing.
Yes, because they would actually fingerprint people who bought things on their stamps, and that would be a receipt, and they would have to bring it back. So it's very ironic that that's way back in like 600s BC.
Yeah, yeah.
And now we have in the early 1900s, they're printing off handbooks to teach children how to do their own type of forensics at home.
That's neat.
It is neat. I loved it so much. I don't have my own kit, but I really wanted it.
And another part of, like, especially with Nancy Drew, they've also done a recent show for Hardy Boys in 2020. I have not watched that one.
I caught a couple episodes.
Okay,
it was interesting. It definitely is a veer off of the original stories.
Yes,
but not to that effect.
Okay.
They're bringing it more towards a murder focus.
Okay. Yes.
And the mother is out of the picture, and that's all I'll say.
Okay. Yeah. Don't give too much away. Right.
But it looks interesting.
And with Nancy Drew, they have her new TV show
on the CW.
Yes. And that came out in 2019. And I haven't started anything this season, but it's been really good. And there's a lot of supernatural aspects added into the show besides murder.
Yeah. I think that goes along with how CW has made their genre of their TVs. I mean, you got to think they've got Supernatural was on for 15 seasons.
Right. Yes.
I was a diehard Supernatural for the first couple, and then I kind of
I've heard that from a lot of people.
I love the car. I love Jensen Ackles. Okay, love the car, but. And then they have to bring in some of the supernatural because they still have the Flash. They've done a new Smallville crossover with Superman.
Yes, you're right. Yes.
And so I think that's the trend. That's the genre of today that most people are expected to see, because we have the Avengers, we have the DC Comics superhero world.
Oh, and remember who I said I couldn't remember who another Holmes was, thinking of Marvel DC, Henry Cavill in the movie with called Enola Holmes, with the actress who plays 11 on Stranger Things, and he played her brother Sherlock.
Yep. And then tie into the Marvel universe with that, with Benedict Cumberbatch being Doctor Strange.
Yes.
You also have Robert Downey Jr., who was Sherlock Holmes and played Iron Man, had his own sidekick with Jude Law.
Yes.
So it's like this all degrees of separation are getting a little too tight, not really separating very much, because everybody's coming into play together.
And looping all of that, keeping, like you said, little tiny spider webs of, connectedness. With DC, we have who else that we're going to really focus on that ties into the comic detective in our next episode.
Batman. You gotta have the Batman.
Yes.
I mean, come on. The dark, the mysterious, the perfect detective with no superpowers except for his deductive reasoning.
Exactly.
I mean, if there is any character that Dupine would most like or most be like, I would have to say it would be Batman, Bruce Wayne.
He just does not have he does not go out and fight people physically.
No, Dupine
he fights them with his mind.
No, Dupine.
But yes, I agree.
Uses his mind.
Yes.
But Dupine was one of those who was very underrated.
Yes.
Who kept a persona in real life on society being on the arm of society's high echelon. When you think about Batman, Bruce Wayne does the exact same thing.
Exactly.
He's got two personalities. He's got the persona that he shows to the world, and then he's got the Dark Knight that he keeps hidden.
Exactly.
And then Dupine is the same way. He's got this other side to where he has to figure out these things and know what's going on and figure it all out, but not many people would give him the time of day.
Exactly. Yes.
So I think it's great. And
it is.
if we tie in Batman, we have to tie in Harley Quinn on the other end.
Yes.
And who does Harley Quinn remind you of that we might have talked about? Miss Agatha Christie actually had a character named Harley Quinn.
Yes, but
who was
Harley Quinn for her was
a detective sidekick.
Yes.
And so that's really weird.
But not a lady.
Yes, not a lady. It was a man. And I love how if you look at the cover for these short stories, because it was a short story, he was one of her many stories.
Yes, she had a lot of small little other groupings of people that were in her stories that were
the
detecting.
detectives was Mr. Satterthwaite. And then Harley Quinn would help him by pushing him to find the right answers and to ask the right questions. But the character, if you look at the cover of the book of, the stories of Harley Quinn from Agatha Christie, he looks like a court jester in red and white and black.
That's pretty cool.
And I'm like, okay, I know where DC Comics come up with this character. That's not really creative license, no.
Yes, exactly.
But, I mean, the comics were another popularity time. You had Batman, you had Superman, you had all of them coming into play, and it was doing the exact same thing. They were there to fight crime and to bring justice into the world, and they were doing that in a more, not really subvert, but more of an overt way, even though keeping their identity secret.
And you're kind of coming back with, and we'll go into more of this next time, but even that link of the kind of bumbling police, because sometimes Commissioner Gordon is little, or the people under him would drop the ball. And one thing I said earlier, and I just double checked myself, I said Lestat, it's Lestrade. And I wanted to correct myself on that.
Okay, Lestat was something else. Lestat was the vampire. Interview with the Vampire.
Yes,
wrong one.
Yeah. Wrong L.
Wrong L. Lestrade. Yes. Lestrade was the bumbling. No.
Yeah, sometimes my brain is not all full.
Hey, I mean, sometimes it is so full. Like earlier, I couldn't even remember the name of Angela Lansbury. Jessica. We went from Jessica to Roger Rabbit's Jessica.
Exactly.
So you never know
but
where
that's
it might
okay.
go.
Exactly.
That's the whole thing with 6 degrees of separation. You can always tie everything and allude to something else.
And sometimes it's circular. Sometimes it's a net that's cast out in all these different directions.
And sometimes it goes perpendicular, and then sometimes it goes parallel.
Yes.
You never know where it might take you.
Exactly.
Who knew that Edgar Allan Poe would start all this with 3 short miniseries in a newspaper?
I know.
And then he was, still alive and kicking today, he would be a very popular man.
Yes. Oh my
Even
gosh,
more
he
so
would be a literature rock star.
Exactly. If we had one, he would be it.
Yes.
He would be the Marvel Universe world.
Yes, absolutely.
So I kind of miss him.
I do too.
Yeah. But I love the detective.
We'll have to figure out how to time travel.
Yeah. I mean, they've made many books about that. And I think, didn't Matthew McConaughey go on the
we'll
time
probably
machine?
allude to some of that during our science.
You know it when we're talking about science and science fiction.
Oh, yes.
We'll probably travel back in time. You never know.
That's exactly right.
So, but yeah, we've got Edgar Allan Poe in the 1840s.
Yes.
That he trickled down to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and then that went to Agatha Christie, and then that went to the Hardy Boys, and then that went into Dick Tracy and Perry Mason, and
Batman was in that era a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and you got the comics versions popping up with the Batman.
Exactly.
With his sidekick Robin.
Yes.
Who was most of the time not very well treated.
Right.
Or respected because they thought he was just a bumbling idiot.
Yes.
So in aspect you have that instead of having the detectives.
Right.
And the police officers, you have the sidekick who is taking on the position of being the town idiot.
Right. Yeah.
In the whole criminal world, even though he was very much learning and becoming a Batman.
Right. Exactly.
So, it's very interesting.
It all just comes back to Poe.
Exactly. We started it all with him, and The Dark Knight has definitely got the Edgar Allan Poe macabre.
Yes.
Because everything in Gotham City is dark. He's got the Dark Knight.
And hello, bats.
I know, the bats. It's the bats. And I wonder if he's ever been walled in anywhere.
I don't know. We'll have to look that up.
However, he has his own Batcape, so he walls himself in.
That's true. And then there's the elements of some of the villains. You know, we could go on and on, like, Catwoman, cats.
Yes, exactly. The black cats and the bad guys.
And hello, Vincent Price was one of the Bat villains back in the 60s TV show.
With Adam West.
Yes, Egghead.
Yes, it's so weird.
I know. Again, everything comes back to Poe.
Yeah, and sometimes I wonder, is it Poe or is it just the people and their love of Poe?
That's a very good question.
Because are they writing these things? Are they creating these things based on the influence of Edgar Allan Poe and his writing, or the influence of just Edgar Allan Poe and their fanaticism?
True.
That would
be a good survey to ask.
That would be a good poll to put up on the website and the Facebook.
We should
do that.
Yes, we should. All right.
Well,
we have enjoyed talking about our first degree of detective under the literature element.
Exactly. Our Dupine. We hope that you will actually look into it yourself and watch the movies.
Yes.
And if you can think of anything else that you may think of the detective that might tie in with Edgar Allan Poe, please drop us a line on Facebook.
We'd love to hear it.
On on Twitter. I think we also have a Twitter account now.
We do. We have a Twitter account now.
You'll have to tell them what that is because I don't remember.
Our Twitter account.
We know the Facebook is 6 Degrees of Edgar Allan Poe, if you're looking for us on Facebook.
Yes, and our Twitter is 6 Degrees of Poe.
There you go. See?
Yes.
So check us out on Twitter and drop us a line with any ideas you might have of the detective series and Dupine and all that.
Yes.
But the quote that I would like to say that we are going to end today is actually from The Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Nice.
It will be found, in fact, that the ingenious are always fanciful, and the truly imaginative never otherwise than analytic.
Poe out.